My parents' professors called me a mistake and were ashamed of my existence. Years later, they begged me to keep quiet. My name is Maggie Collins, and I was a mistake in a perfectly constructed formula. My parents were people known by their last names in academic circles. Robert Collins, a professor of applied physics with dozens of publications in leading scientific journals. Evelyn Collins, a neurobiologist who participated in projects featured on scientific websites and university press releases. Their life was strict, meticulous, almost sterile. Everything in it was subordinated to logic, rationality, and future success. And then I came along. "We found out too late," my mother would say, usually at moments when she thought I wasn't listening. If only there had been time. She never finished the sentence. But I knew perfectly well how it should have ended. My older sister, Claire, was born just 10 months before me. To others, we looked like twins, identical blonde hair, gray-blue eyes, and delicate features. Teachers at kindergarten confused us, and relatives would remark, "How identical." But at home, no one confused us. Claire was a marvel. I was a backdrop. From early childhood, everything was clear. At 2, Claire knew her alphabet. At 3, she could put words together. At 5, she was reading books intended for teenagers. At 5, I loved nothing more than running around, talking to the neighbors, laughing, and asking what my parents considered stupid questions. "Look, Maggie," my father said enthusiastically, pointing at my sister. "Claire already understands the principle of cause and effect." I stood nearby, clutching a teddy bear, not understanding what cause and effect meant. But I sensed something else, that the joy in the room wasn't for me. When Claire turned 4, her mother introduced her to some professors she knew. "She solves logic problems for kids 2 years older," she said with barely concealed pride. And when the conversation turned to me, Mom would wave her hand vaguely. "Well, Maggie is very outgoing." The word outgoing was almost a diagnosis in our house. At school, the difference became painfully obvious. Claire quickly skipped the curriculum and was transferred to a gifted class. Her name appeared in the school news, on certificate boards, in parent newsletters. My name appeared only on attendance lists. I tried. Honestly, I pored over my textbooks, copied assignments, and memorized rules. But the numbers got jumbled, the formulas were too complex to grasp, and the math tests made me panic. "It's elementary," my father said irritably, looking at my notebooks. "This is 3rd grade level." I was 9. I looked at the numbers, and they seemed to slip away from me, like water through my fingers. "You're just not trying," my mother added. "Intelligence is discipline." That evening, I heard them discussing me in the kitchen. "A genetic defect," my father said quietly. "It happens," my mother replied. "Not all children can be outstanding." I lay in bed, clutching my pillow to keep from bursting into tears. If Claire was the pride of the family, I was an awkward pause in conversation. At family dinners, we talked about science, discoveries, and research. I tried to interject something of my own, a funny story from school, a story about a friend, a joke. "Maggie," Mom would interrupt sharply. "Stop laughing for no reason. It's a sign of low self-control." I'd fall silent. Meanwhile, my sister was reading a book, her eyes downcast. Occasionally, a faint smile would play across her lips. When I was 10, there was a school project fair. Claire presented a paper on molecular biology. She won first place. I did a project on urban community and helping the elderly. It was neat, sincere, but not scientific. On the way home, my parents talked only about Claire. "Terrific potential," my father said. "She has a brilliant future ahead of her." "And Maggie." My mother paused. Maggie's just not our strong suit. I looked out the car window and felt something inside me break. That moment was the first time I realized, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be what they wanted me to be. I didn't fit their formula. But I didn't know then that sometimes a miscalculation can change the whole outcome. Adolescence didn't bring me relief. It only made everything more obvious. Claire grew up like a project into which the best resources were poured. They found schools, tutors, and science clubs for her. She spent her summers at camps for gifted children, first in California, then abroad. When she returned, her suitcase was filled with books, certificates, and stories about people who would change the world. I stayed home. It's too early for Maggie, Mom said, not looking up from her laptop. Let her brush up on her basics first. I stretched on for years. When I turned 13, my parents decided it was time for an honest conversation. We were sitting at the dinner table. The light was too bright, the silence too thick. "We're not all the same," Dad began, steepling his fingers. "Claire has a rare way of thinking." Mom nodded. "That doesn't make you bad," she added. "It's just you need to be realistic." "Realistic about what?" I asked. They exchanged glances. "In expectations," Mom said. "Not everyone is destined to achieve academic excellence." I felt a wave rise inside me. Not anger, but emptiness. From that day on, no one asked me about the future. No one asked me what I wanted to become, what I wanted to achieve. It was as if my trajectory had ceased to matter. At school, I clung to my friends. I knew how to listen, support, and make people laugh. People gravitated toward me, and it was my salvation. I was the one people turned to for advice, the one they shared secrets with. But at home, none of that meant anything. "Popularity is no indicator of intelligence," my mother would say as she passed. "Leadership without intelligence is useless," my father would add. Claire, meanwhile, was growing colder. We used to at least talk sometimes. Now she looked at me like a failed experiment. "You're wasting your time," she said one day as I was getting ready to meet up with friends. "While you're chatting, I'm working." I didn't respond. At 15, I failed my first important math test. My parents were called to school. A teaching awaited me at home. "It's shameful," my father said. "Our child can't solve basic problems." "Maybe she should focus on something more practical," Mom suggested. Not everyone is cut out for theory. The word practical sounded like a death sentence. That evening, I locked myself in my room and, for the first time, allowed myself to consider, what if I really am worthless? The answer came unexpectedly. Our neighbor, Mrs. Harper, was rarely noticed. An elderly woman, a widow, with a small house and a garden. One day, I helped her carry her bags, and she invited us in for tea. From that day on, I began visiting her regularly. Mrs. Harper taught me how to cook simple meals, budget, and talk to people. But most importantly, she listened. "You know, Maggie," she said one day, "smart isn't just about formulas. It's also about the ability to see people." These words stuck with me. In high school, the pressure became unbearable. Claire was preparing to attend Princeton. It was all anyone talked about at home. My future seemed to have vanished. When the SAT scores came back, I realized it was the end of my illusions. "This is a disaster," my father shouted, waving the papers. "You'll embarrass us." "You didn't even try," my mother said coldly. Claire stood in the doorway. She said nothing. She just stared. I didn't sleep that night. I realized that if I stayed here, I would completely lose myself. The next day, I got a job at a small coffee shop downtown. My first paycheck was paltry, but it was mine. When I told my parents, they didn't even ask where or what I was doing.
Do whatever you want, Mom said.
Just don't interfere with Claire's preparation for the future. I started saving, planning, thinking. I didn't yet know where I was going, but I knew where I was leaving, and that was the beginning of my journey. The coffee shop became my refuge. It was located on the corner of a bustling street in Cambridge, just a few blocks from the university campuses where my parents spent most of their lives. The irony was almost mocking. I was serving lattes to graduate students and professors discussing theories, grants, and publications, everything that defined a person's worth in the eyes of my family. But here, behind the counter, none of that mattered. It was important here that I smile, remember the regulars' orders, and be able to smooth over the dissatisfaction of the caffeine-free morning customers. And I did it perfectly. You have a talent for working with people, the manager, a tall man named Thomas, said one day. Not everyone has that. This phrase hurt me more than he could have imagined. It was the first time I'd been told I had talent, without a but afterward. The atmosphere at home was growing increasingly cold. My parents barely paid attention to me. They were preoccupied with Claire's future, her admission, her recommendations, her publications. I was like furniture, present but irrelevant. I tried to be inconspicuous. I left early and returned late. I hid my money in a shoebox. I was saving for freedom, though I didn't yet know what it would be like. The turning point came one rainy evening. I returned home late. My shift had gone on long. The light was on in the living room. My parents were waiting for me. "Where have you been?" Mom asked. "At work," I answered calmly. Dad grimaced. "We said it was temporary." "Not for me." Mom stood up abruptly. "You're embarrassing us, Maggie. Do you realize what that looks like? A professor's daughter working as a waitress." "I'm an honest worker," I said. "And I like it." Those words were the last straw. "Then get out," Dad said. "We won't support a grown man without ambition." "And change your last name," Mom added coldly. "We don't want to be associated with that." The room seemed to shrink. I looked at them and suddenly realized it didn't hurt. There had been pain before. Now there was clarity. "Okay," I said. "I'm leaving." I packed my things in an hour. The essentials: clothes, documents, an old laptop. Before leaving, I glanced at the house, at the walls that had never been mine. Claire stood on the stairs. "You chose this," she said. I didn't answer. I spent the night at my friend from the coffee shop, Amy. A small apartment, a couch, the smell of pizza, and the feeling that I could finally breathe. The first months were hard. I worked a lot, picked up extra shifts. Sometimes I didn't have enough money to eat. Sometimes I wanted to go back. But I knew there was no turning back. I rented a room in an old house with 3 other girls. We shared a refrigerator, laughed about our empty wallets, and supported each other. I was learning to live. I learned to pay bills, budget, say no. I learned not to apologize for my existence. I was promoted to senior barista at the coffee shop. I trained newcomers, resolved conflicts, and was responsible for scheduling. They trusted me. Sometimes I'd pass by the university and see my parents from afar. They didn't notice me, and that was for the best. One day, Aunt Linda called me.
"They were asking about you," she said.
"But not because they missed you. They were concerned that you didn't show up at family events." I just chuckled. "I'm not going to." A year passed. I had become different. Not smarter in their eyes, but stronger. More confident. More whole. I didn't yet know who I would become. But I knew I was no longer a shadow. I was myself. Life had settled into the rhythm I'd chosen for myself. I no longer counted every penny with trembling hands. Old fears receded, giving way to a cautious confidence. The room I rented was small and creaky, with a window overlooking the courtyard and a perpetually dripping faucet, but it was mine. I'd return there after a shift at the coffee shop, take off my shoes, turn on the music, and feel like no one measured me by someone else's expectations. I continued working as a senior barista. I was respected, people consulted me. I knew how to resolve conflicts between customers and staff. I knew how to explain and mediate. I knew how to listen. Sometimes Thomas would laugh. If universities recognized people for their ability to manage chaos, you would have been a dean long ago. I smiled, but something inside me resonated, not with pain but with possibility. One summer evening, the coffee shop was packed. A sustainable development conference was taking place nearby, and the flow of customers was constant. People were talking about climate, resources, the future of the planet. I didn't understand the terms, but I heard the intonations: anxiety, excitement, hope. He showed up closer to closing time. Tall, a little confused, with a backpack slung over his shoulder and a jacket that was clearly unsuitable for the heat. He stared at the menu for a long moment, then smiled apologetically. "Sorry," he said, "I don't understand the difference between a latte and a cappuccino." "It's okay," I replied. "It's normal for people who think about things more important than coffee." He laughed. Not politely, but genuinely. "Then save me. I trust you." I made him a drink and handed him the cup. "I'm Maggie," I said. "Ethan," he replied, "and I think this is the best coffee of the day." He started coming more often. Sometimes just for coffee. Sometimes he'd linger and chat. He talked about his work. He was doing research in environmental engineering. He spoke simply, without arrogance. And surprisingly, he asked questions about me. "Do you like it here? What do you want to do next? Have you ever thought about starting your own business?" No one asked me about it seriously. We started dating. No fanfare, no pressure. Walks, dinners, conversations until late at night. I was afraid to tell him about my family, but when I did, his expression didn't change. "It's cruel," he said quietly, "and unfair. Not they're right. Not you have to understand. Just unfair." I met his friends, then his family. They were scientists, engineers, teachers. And I was afraid again of the same look, the same comparison. But his mother, Rosemary, asked me, "Do you enjoy working with people?" "Yes," I replied. "It's a rare gift," she said. "The world depends not only on discoveries, but also on those who know how to connect people." Those words stayed with me. Everything changed one Sunday. We were sitting in Ethan's parents' yard. They were talking about garbage, recycling, how much waste passes through stores and cafes every day. I listened and suddenly caught myself thinking, I know this. I saw it every day. Bags, cups, packaging. "It's crazy," I said. "We throw away tons of plastic that could be used." They fell silent. "At cafes, we throw away mountains of packaging every day," I continued. "But if we could make something useful out of it, people would buy it." I took a napkin and started sketching. Awkwardly, hastily. Outdoor furniture. Durable. Made from recycled plastic. Not as recycled material, but as a stylish product. Ethan looked at me, his eyes wide. It's possible," he said. "Technologically, yes." His father leaned closer. "And there's a market," he added. "A huge one." I sat there, holding my breath. For the first time, my idea wasn't met with silence or condescension. "Do you realize you just invented a business?" Rosemary asked. I didn't answer. I cried. That night I realized I was being seen. And that changed everything. The idea stopped being just an idea faster than I could comprehend. At first, it all seemed like a game. Conversations around the kitchen table, diagrams on napkins, discussions of what-ifs. But Ethan took it seriously, and so did his parents. They didn't pressure or rush, but they asked questions that forced me to think differently. Who is your client? Why would they choose this? What do you want to change? I'd never answered questions like that before. Really? We started small. I continued working at the coffee shop, and in the evenings, we'd gather at Ethan's or his parents'. I talked about what I saw every day, how people reacted to price, appearance, and the story behind a product. I knew what hooked customers, even if I'd never read a marketing textbook. And suddenly, it became valuable. You have a practical mind, Ethan said one day. You see reality, not abstractions. We registered the company. I chose the name myself, Reforma, because it wasn't just about recycling, but also about a new way of thinking, about the fact that value can be reassembled. I quit the coffee shop in tears. That place saved me, but I knew it was time to move on. The first months were hell. Suppliers missed deadlines, equipment broke down, samples came out crooked. We were spending money faster than we were making money. More than once, I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, thinking everything would collapse. And every time fear rose up within me, I heard the old voices. You can't do this. This isn't for you. You're not smart enough. But now there were other voices. Mistakes are normal, Ethan said. You're learning, Rosemary added. And quickly, we got our first contract for a small city park. Benches. Nothing grand. But when I saw them installed, smooth, sturdy, made from what had once been trash, my knees gave way. It was real. It was mine. Gradually, people started writing about us. First local publications, then regional ones. I gave interviews, shaking with excitement, but every time I said the same thing. I'm not a scientist. I'm a person who saw a problem and realized I could solve it. Reforma was growing. We were expanding our product line, hiring people. I was learning how to manage, not from books, but through mistakes, conversations, and observations. I knew how to motivate, how to listen, how not to break people. And this again proved to be my strength. 2 years later, we were invited to participate in a government environmental project. A big one. Too big for me not to be scared. That's when I saw my last name again for the first time in official documents. Collins. I stared at it for a long time. You don't have to use it, Ethan said. It's your choice. I thought about it, and that same day I applied for a name change. I became Maggie Harper, in honor of the very neighbor who once saw value in me when my family couldn't. It was symbolic.
And rightfully so.
Preparations for the state environmental awards ceremony were in full swing. We had been nominated. I tried not to think too much, but inside I was trembling. Even if we don't win, Ethan said, you've already done the impossible. On the day of the ceremony, I wore a simple dress. Nothing fancy. I didn't want to appear worthy in anyone's eyes.
I wanted to be myself.
The hall was full. Scientists, officials, investors. And suddenly I saw familiar faces. My parents.
And Claire.
They stood to the side, surveying the room with the familiar confidence of people who believe they rightfully belong here. Our gazes met. Recognition flashed in my mother's eyes. Then shock. Then something like calculation. I felt my insides tighten. But I didn't turn away. Are you ready? Ethan asked, squeezing my hand. Yes, I answered. I was ready. The hall was bathed in soft light, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. People were talking in hushed tones. Waiters glided between the rows, serving drinks. Everything looked solemn, deliberate, as befits a ceremony where the fate of grants, reputations, and future projects are decided. I sat next to Ethan and tried to breathe evenly. Somewhere in the back of the hall were my parents. I felt their presence almost physically, like a cold draft behind me. I didn't turn around, but I knew they were watching, evaluating, comparing. When the host began listing the nominees, my heart began to beat faster. Reforma came in third for their contribution to sustainable urban development and innovative approach to plastic recycling. I couldn't hear the rest. The winner is
Reforma.
Applause filled the hall. Ethan squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. You did it, he whispered. I stood up. My legs trembled, but my back was straight. I walked toward the stage, feeling each step tear me away from the past, slowly, but finally. And then everything went wrong. Wait, a voice rang out. I recognized it instantly. My mother. She was already on stage, somehow ahead of me, confident, collected, with that same expression I remembered from childhood, the expression of someone accustomed to speaking even when it wasn't given. I beg your pardon, she said into the microphone. I can't help but say a few words. A murmur went through the hall. Someone recognized her. Professor Collins was still a well-known figure. I'm Maggie's mother, she continued, turning to me with a strained smile. And her father, and I always knew she would succeed. Intelligence and the drive to develop are a tradition in our family. I stood next to her and felt a wave rise within me, not hysterical, not destructive.
Clear. Cool. Mature.
I carefully took the microphone from her hands. Thank you, I said calmly. Now allow me. The room fell silent. I turned to the crowd. My name is Maggie Harper, I began. And yes, I was born into a family of renowned scientists. I paused. But I'm standing here today not because of that, but in spite of it. A murmur ran through the room. I continued. When I was a child, intelligence was measured by tests, achievements, and meeting expectations. When I didn't fit into that system, they made me realize I was a failure. That I should be quieter, lower, more inconspicuous. I saw my mother turn pale, my father stand up and then immediately sit back down. They asked me to leave home, to change my last name, to not bring shame on the family, I said evenly. And so I left. The room was dead silent. I worked as a waitress, a barista, a manager. I learned not in universities but from life. I learned to see people, to understand needs, to find solutions where others saw, beyond my level. I looked at Ethan, then at his parents. These people believed in me when I had no titles or degrees. Just an idea and a desire to make the world a little better. I raised the award. Reforma is not a story about genius. It's a story about support, about how intelligence comes in all shapes and sizes. And that human worth isn't determined by a last name or status. I turned to my mother. I'm grateful for your life, I said quietly. But pride isn't something that appears when it becomes profitable. You've lost the right to speak on my behalf. I handed the microphone back to the MC and stepped back. The room erupted in applause. People stood up. Some cried. Some looked at my parents with open condemnation. They left before the ceremony was over. Claire walked behind them, her head bowed. I didn't feel triumph, only relief. After the ceremony, people approached me, strangers, important people, different people. Thank you, they said. That was important to hear. Later, that night, Ethan and I sat at home, in silence. You were incredible, he said. I smiled. I just told the truth. Time passed. Reforma continued to grow. We opened new production facilities and expanded our projects. I began to speak out, not as someone's daughter, but as the founder and director. Sometimes I thought about the future, about children. And I knew one thing for sure. My child would never be unwanted. Because now I had a voice, and I wasn't going to lose it anymore.